Welcome back to the Global Marriage Booster. Joining us from England is Harry Benson. Harry, thank you for taking the time to be here with us. We really, really appreciate it. Harry Benson is a marriage educator and marriage researcher. He has written a phenomenal book, Commit or Quit, and he's the research director at the Marriage Foundation of the UK. It's really an honor to have you with us here today.
I'm hugely grateful for you asking me.
Okay, great. So let's jump in. Tell us, why do you think marriage is still relevant in the 21st century?
It is massively relevant in the 21st century. And I'm a big fan of marriage, not because of some sense of outdated traditions or stuff. I'm a huge fan of marriage because the psychology of marriage and the evidence about marriage goes so strongly with the grain of human nature. And that's why I'm a fan of marriage. And the evidence suggests that by and large, marriage works more than it doesn't for most people, despite what one hears about divorce rates and the like, and we can perhaps talk about that a little bit. But I mean, what it does, what marriage encapsulates is important aspects of commitment. We all want reliable love. We all want people to stick around with us, for the foreseeable future. We want someone who's going to be there even when we behave badly, even someone who copes with our human foibles, our fallibility, our fallenness, if you like. And very few people go through life and get to the end of their lives having never actually lived with somebody. In the UK, it's in single figures of percentage, fewer women, slightly more men, but it's 5 to 8% of people in the UK never actually live with someone by the time they're in their 60s. So if we want to make a success of our love together, of our life together, there are some certain sort of prerequisites for success and for getting that reliability. And there are things like being clear about where we stand so that we both know we're on the same page. We both need to be committed to one another. We need to know that that plan is going to work for life. And we need to remove ambiguity. That's really important. So I think when we ask that question of one another, will you spend the rest of your life with me? And the answer is yes. You're putting each other on the same page. You're removing ambiguity. You're being really clear about where you want to go. And you're saying, yeah, let's start this adventure together. They don't always work out, but you start with the right kind of intention. And, compare with businesses, almost no businesses have been hugely successful over time without starting with some sort of a plan. And relationships are no different. And that's why marriage is important. It's the plan to make things work together. Everybody knows where they stand, and it's a plan for life. Doesn't always work out, but that's the plan.
Nice. Really, really nice. Now, you've done a ton of research on marriage and commitment. Can you share some of that with us? I know it's volumes and volumes, but can you sort of summarize it in a nutshell?
Well, one of the surprising things in many countries outside of the US, and obviously in the UK, we're one of those, there's a real paucity of good research on marriage. There's lots and lots of stuff comes out of the US, and there are good journals, academic journals that one can read, the Journal of Marriage and Family, Family Relations, Family Psychology, that sort of thing. But there's precious little in the UK, and the number of researchers are actually involved in the field of marriage and commitment. And essentially what works are precious few. They're few and far between. And so a lot of what I've done over the last 8 years, you can find all of our research is all very clearly publicly available on our website, marriagefoundation.org.uk. And the sorts of things that we've looked into have been looking at big national surveys, and we have wonderful survey work in the UK. We are incredibly blessed with our country spends an absolute fortune on really great big long-term household surveys, big cohort studies which follow a group of people along from birth all the way up to adulthood, And there's about 4 or 5 of those in the UK. And so we look at those sorts of studies and we can track people over time. And you can see essentially the difference between families who start off as a married family when their child is born, and you can compare them alongside families who don't marry, who might otherwise look very similar. You can sort of statistically compare the two side by side. So you can look at families with similar education, similar ethnicity, similar age, that sort of thing, and even similar happiness as well. And you can see how things turn out over time. So one of the sort of key themes that we keep coming back to is actually how married parents do so much better in terms of stability, in terms of staying together and achieving that reliable love, which presumably everybody sets out to achieve. They're the ones who are more likely to stay together. We also have looked at things like teenage mental health as well, and some of the predictors of that. You know, family breakdown is a huge driver, if not the biggest driver of teenage mental health problems. If your family split up, and I know my background is that my parents split up when I was 3, and my mother wonderfully remarried when I was 9 and is still married, you know, 50 years later. It's wonderfully and doing really well. But was it 50 years later? Yeah, it was 50 years later. Yeah, so she's done amazingly well. But I'd never had a father and a mother living in the same house, and that's been somehow in my background all the way along, and it had a knock-on effect into my own marriage, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But in terms of the research, there are big effects of family breakdown. You know, even when parents do a wonderful job, and I'm a huge fan of lone parents. And I want to make that crystal clear. I think they do an incredible job with one pair of hands, but that's not their life goal for most people. Very few people go into it like that. So our research is essentially mostly about stability and outcomes for children, you know, and about who marries. You know, there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor. We've done some papers on that. I've just done another one which is about to come out. That sort of thing. You know, do unhappy marriages stay unhappy forever? No, they don't. We did some research on that. How do celebrities get on? Celebrity divorce rates are much higher than anybody else's. I think we've done the only research on that. I've replicated 3 times. I've got a data set of 400 celebrity couples, half of whom I'd never heard of, but they all, you know, they're all in the magazines. And I've been following them for about 18, 19 years now. And so we've got a really good database of how celebs get on, that kind of thing. So that's the research that we do.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. You know, you said something earlier about your own process. Would you feel comfortable sharing a bit of how you came to this in your own marriage?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, we should never have got into the trouble we got into. I mean, background always plays a huge part. And my background, my parents split up. I was sent to boarding school, and I've since realised that it's the combination of boarding school from age 7 to 17. For me, and not for everybody, but for me, was a pretty toxic combination with the fact that my parents had split up before that. And so I started out, having finished school, with very much a sense of abandonment from parents, and therefore I've got to make it on my own, and it's better not to feel. So I was pretty rubbish at relationships. I went into the military for 8 years and did all sorts of things there, during which time I met Kate, my wife. Amazingly, she ended up being my first girlfriend. We sort of courted in the old-fashioned sense for a couple of years and then got married. But I was pretty closed, and I think it was frustrating for Kate to live with somebody who she liked because I had qualities that she was looking for, sort of decency, commitment, loyalty, honesty, integrity, that sort of thing. And she was bubbly and vivacious and extrovert and all the things I wasn't. And then we ended up, we moved out to Asia, and we had our first we had 2 children one was born in Bangkok and one was born in Hong Kong. And we did the kind of classic thing of growing apart. You know, while we were in the years before we had kids, we had tremendous fun together. And I think that papered over a lot of the cracks in our communication, and the fact that I was so poor at emotions and feelings and stuff. But when we had kids, the dynamics of the family changed, and I loved my daughters. I was totally in love with my daughters, but her attention shifted to our daughters, essentially away from me, and my attention shifted to our daughters and to work, of course, to pay the bills. And the result was that we very gradually and very slowly drifted apart. And I've subsequently realized that I think this is a real classic of how parents handle the transition to marriage. For me, is the sort of almost the most important thing after the initial stage of commitment. I think handling that transition into parenthood is hugely important because it sets the tone for the rest of your marriage. And I think it explains why, as women take charge of babies, because you've spent 9 months growing a baby inside you, you're thinking about the baby all day, every day. Whereas as a man, I can learn that, but it's not an automatic process as it is for a mum. And that changes mum's attention. So Kate, she's very gradually shifted her attention to the baby, and no one was looking after the relationship. And, so we became a couple who were really functional parents and drifted apart. It was, can you do this? Can you do that? Yeah, sure. And eventually that kind of, can you do this? Can you do that? And my lack of taking the initiative, because Kate was such a brilliant mother, it became frustrating for her to keep asking the question, can you do this? And it became frustrating for me to keep hearing it. So, it's easy to see how we drifted apart. And so it was really only when we started to deal with it, and Kate sort of cried out and said, I need a friend and we need to do something about it, that we started to sort the mess out. But it was a real classic, and I think growing apart, there's surveys that show that growing apart is the number one factor in divorce. Not fighting each other and stuff, it's just not talking anymore and losing the common ground and stopping being friends.
That is so true. And oftentimes couples are actually doing pretty well. And then the first child comes along and things start to fall apart. This wonderful gift of a child can cause
Sure.
us to lose touch with the romance in our marriage and lose touch with each other. We all have to learn how to stay close as a couple and also branch into parenthood. So what did you learn along the way? What are your tips? There's so many couples listening that are struggling with this transition. So what's your advice?
I think the most fundamental thing that I'm going to say, and probably the most controversial, is that once you've become parents, the person with the capacity to take responsibility for the relationship tends to be more the dad than the mum. The mum's capacity to put attention onto a relationship has definitely diminishes because her focus is so much on this baby who's come out of her. And she spent 9 months training her brain to think baby, 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 baby. I've spoken to thousands of mums who and nobody disagrees with this idea that people are thinking about it automatically. So the guy is the man who has the capacity to take responsibility for the relationship. And whereas up until parenthood, it can be very much give and take, ebb and flow, and you can both be utterly equal. I think one of the errors that we make in our society where equality has become such a thing, and in many really great ways, and I'm not pushing people down roles at all. I think, if somebody wants to do the baby and someone wants to do the work, I don't care who does it, that kind of thing, gender stereotyping, I'm not bothered by that. But there are definitely, with equality, I think we've made the mistake of thinking of people as being the same. And they're not. Men and women definitely have differences. I'm not in the John Gray camp, but there are a lot of things in terms of relationships where men and women definitely differ, and commitment's one of them. And I think responsibility for a relationship is another. And it was really that was the trigger that when I finally read this despairing letter from Kate, in the mess that we got into, when she sent me a job spec of what it was to be Harry's wife, and the terms and conditions and the hours and the holiday and the money and all that sort of stuff, and the car and the travel and whatever, and the hours, and then at the end, but she said, but what I really want is a friend, and will I ever get one? Who knows, and who cares? We were 8 years into our marriage at this stage, and I dropped to the floor, and I just thought, my goodness, what have I done? I can't believe. And so I went to Kate and I said, look, you've got no reason to believe me. And she hadn't. but I'm going to change. And in somewhere in my head, this little flick switch where I realized I'm going to take responsibility for this, actually, and I'm going to make this work. And of course, it was difficult because she didn't believe me. Why should she? You know, you can make things better for a week or so. But it was, that little step was huge. And I think I've subsequently, I mean, I've done so much research on this. I never wanted to assume that our experience is the generic experience. But the more research I've done on this, the more I think it's a very, very common experience, is that this growing apart thing as parent, you know, that then sets the tone for how you divide your roles in your family, you know, and why women are always, quite rightly, complaining that they go out to work, but they're still doing the overwhelming majority of the housework. Well, it starts in this transition to parenthood where women want to do most of that initially. But then that doesn't have to be the way after that. And it's where men are not taking responsibility for the relationship, is the frustrations draw in. And so I think that's been the biggest thing.
That is a great message. Thank you, Harry. That's learned on your own skin and in your own research. Okay, so what do you think, based on all of your research, what are 2 vital pieces of advice you would tell every married couple?
First of all, be clear. You really need clarity in a relationship. The biggest killer in a relationship is ambiguity. I've talked about that before. And not knowing what the other person's thinking, not knowing what their intentions are, not being completely certain, you know, which is one of the biggest reasons why most marriages tend to do well. Most unmarriages, most cohabiting couples who don't marry, tend not to do so well, although some obviously do. But clarity, I think, is really important because it kills ambiguity, and ambiguity is just, for me, the biggest risk to a relationship. Second thing, commitment. It's having, it's not just being clear with one another. It's actually about having a plan to spend life together and being really certain that's what you're going to achieve and wanting to work at it. And that's what commitment is. There's some really interesting research going way back. Well, actually not going way back. A couple of American studies have looked at the influence of weddings on subsequent marriage. And a couple of the factors they looked at was how many guests people had at their wedding and how much money they spent at their wedding. Having more guests makes a big difference to your subsequent marriage, or there's a link anyway. Whereas spending more money tends to work the other way. The more money you spend, the more at risk your marriage is. That's obviously not always true, but these are factors. And I think one of the things that's important about this commitment is actually celebrating it in front of other people. You know, when we forget that when we commit to one person, we're actually saying no to everybody else. We're closing the doors on all the other options. We're burning our bridges and saying, that's it, this is the person, this is the one person. The morning of my wedding day was the most frightening moment of my life. And I've been to war, I've been in the military, I've been shot at and all that sort of stuff. It was nothing compared to the morning of my wedding day, when I just thought, my goodness, what am I letting myself in for? But the moment I see all my friends and family there essentially rooting for me and for us, what I'm hearing is, great choice, Harry, such a good choice, you've done well. And I'm thinking, yeah, I did make a great choice. And I think that celebration's part of commitment. And that's been a difficulty during lockdown, because our restrictions here in the UK, weddings were banned altogether for months. And then they said, oh, you can have a 30-person celebration. It's now down to 15. So it's pretty pathetic, really. But I hope if that reduces the gigantic expectations of over-the-top weddings, then that would be a good thing, because it's the poorest who are not marrying now. We've just done another piece of research on this. You know, the rich are still marrying in their droves. The poorest are running for the hills, because the rich have spent all their time telling them that marriage doesn't matter, and yet they all do it. So there's an element of hypocrisy there. Anyway, that's by the by. So commitment. So we've talked about clarity and commitment, but I think we've got to pass on the older ones among us who've actually seen the benefits of marriage and aren't too cynical about the whole thing. And, you know, yeah, divorce happens. People do split up, but we've got to pass that on, that human nature wants reliability. And we want somebody who's going to be there. And the act of marriage is not some old fusty traditional thing. It's actually, it represents all these important things that we really need. It represents clarity and commitment and celebration and all those things. And I think that's the biggest thing that we need to be handing on to the next generation, to re-inspire people, particularly in lower income groups who've, for whatever reason, have got frightened of the huge burden of some completely over-the-top wedding, which is totally unnecessary. Actually, we just need some kind of a celebration and then get on with our marriage, knowing that we're both on the same page. And that's what makes a difference.
Fantastic. Clarity, commitment, and celebration. That pretty much sums up what we're doing here on this Global Marriage Summit. Thank you, Harry. That was beautiful. And I hope that everyone will pick up a copy of your book, Commit or Quit, to learn more about your most important research. You know, so many of my college-age students are under the impression that cohabiting couples have the same breakup rate that married couples have. Have you done any research regarding breakup rates for couples living together versus couples that are married?
We did a study of, there's a big longitudinal study in the UK called Understanding Society, and it used to be called the British Household Panel Survey. And we looked at a little sample of parents in that group of about 1,700 mums who had 14 or 15-year-olds. And we tracked back to when they were born. Were they married before they had their babies? Did they marry afterwards? Or did they never marry? As couples, where they just cohabiting and never actually got around to marriage. And we looked at the breakup rates, and essentially, I mean, in broad terms, about a quarter of those who were married before they had their kids split up. About a half of those who married after they had their kids split up, and that's a bizarre phenomenon. I'll come back to that. And then about 3/4 of the ones who never married split up. So, you know, we hear a lot about divorce rates. What we don't hear about is the much harder to measure stuff of where unmarried couples split up. And we do all our work with parents because we think that's the, you know, it's where there's a kid there ought to be some degree of commitment. And you're looking at like with like when you're comparing married with cohabiting. And that was really, really interesting. So about a quarter of married, if you're married before you have a child, half break up if they marry afterwards, and 3/4 if they, in very round terms, if they never marry. The really interesting group for me was the half who split up after they've had their baby. You think there's a 15-year period. So at some point during this 15 years, they've gone along and they've got married. At some point during that time, I mean, who knows how far down, they love each other enough to have a baby. They loved each other enough to get married. And then half of them split up, more of them split up than the ones who were originally married. And that just seems utterly bizarre until you think that just maybe the people who got married before they had their kids mostly were deciders rather than sliders. So they're the ones, this is Denver University language, Scott Stanley and Galena Rhodes and Howard Markman. But they're deciders rather than sliders. So they bought into the idea, they committed very clearly about their future. They planned their births as well, that was more common. But the ones who married afterwards, I suspect, and I don't know this for sure, obviously, but I suspect this is family saying, you know, when are you going to do the right thing? When are you going to tie the knot? And they're getting married not because they want to, you know, pledge their commitment to one another for the rest of their lives. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do or whatever. And so they're sliding into it without really fully buying in. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a bit like going for a walk. And if you and I say we're going to go for a walk this afternoon, and we say, right, we're going to go for a walk, and along the way it starts raining. We think, well, you know, we said we'd go for a walk. We'll just walk through the rain, and we come out the other side, and the sun shines, and it's lovely. But you imagine if we say, let's go for a walk, but let's see how it goes. Okay, and we haven't really fully bought into it. That's the difference between deciding and sliding. Is buying in or just saying, I'll just see how it goes and go with the flow, and never really actually make clear, you know, and as soon as it starts raining, you think, I can't cope with this anymore, let's go back. And that's the difference in commitment between deciders and sliders. And that's what I think's happened with parents who've married afterwards. So I'm not a marriage at all cost person. I think marriage and the timing of marriage is crucial, and the intent behind it is really crucial. You need to do it because you want to. And that's what we're seeing in the collapse in divorce rates in the West that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years. The overall fall, so forget what's happened during COVID time, but the overall fall in divorce rates over the last 20, 30 years, I think that reflects that more men in particular have been buying into the idea of marriage. So the ones who are marrying today are mostly, if not all, people who really want it, they're deciders, whereas ones who might have married 20, 30 years ago, there would be a good fair few who were doing it out of social pressure because the families were saying, look, this is a good idea. And, no wonder their relationships break up. They never really bought into it in the first place. It's like New Year's resolutions. If you go for it, you go for it. If you don't, if you think, well, let's just see how it goes, it's not going to work. And that's the same for relationships.
That was brilliant. You have all of these facts at your fingertips. It's been amazing. Thank you so much, Harry Benson, for sharing your wisdom, your research, your heart, your story. It's been such a pleasure.
It's been a huge pleasure for me too. Thank you, Chana.